expanded. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted, myself, Barbara Kapler, and Christopher Johnstone, to have you at our session. We're also pleased that we provided plenty of room for each of you. You may feel free to break into moments of dance to take advantage of all your great space. You are a little bit spread out, but I encourage you to take just a quick second and say hello to someone who's around you, ideally maybe someone you haven't met before. Thank you for participating in the interactive nature of our session. One of the reasons why I wanted you to say hello to someone is, of course, an overall conference goal is that we're meeting individuals, but also, as you'll see from the research that we're presenting, that interaction often requires some type of prompt, that we tend to behave in ways that we are accustomed to, are comfortable with, and walking into a room, particularly for students as a classroom environment, they may or may not have that history of simply introducing themselves to someone that they don't know. Of course, we're looking for a whole lot more than introductions and what students are learning from each other, but we'll jump into that in just a moment. So to get started with our presentation, I wanted to take us back about 40 years. In 1976, Joseph Mestenhauser wrote about learning with international students. This was a handbook with concrete strategies for creating intentional learning environments. Learning was occurring from interactions among international and domestic students, and has been ever since. But 40 years later, that is not the story that our campuses tell. There is much promotion of how international students bring new perspectives to campus, yet many conversations focused almost exclusively on the deficits, the challenges encountered. Throughout the country, there is little to no dialogue on the impact of international students on domestic student learning, for example. Yet that's something most campuses promote as a benefit of hosting international students. And understanding and documenting benefits has not been a part of the research story either. Meaning, if you look at the literature regarding international student experience, it focuses predominantly on the challenges encountered, such as adjustment to a new academic environment, difficulty in making friends, and isolation encountered. So while we speak of benefits of international students and what they bring to our campus, we don't research these benefits directly. Of course there are challenges. We're not fools. But yet we do see as an increase in the international undergraduate student population on campus kind of the possibility that we could spend a lot more time on the challenges and not looking at how do we foster the benefits. And so we're looking to change the story. We believe that the current story is too much of a deficit model, and it's not the full story. As with all good projects, there's an enormous team supporting the research that has been conducted that looks directly at the educational benefits of international students on our campus. We have a team of principal investigators, Christopher Johnstone, who's faculty with the College of Education and Human Development, Gail Woodruff, whose name you might recognize as the coordinator of this conference that we are at today, and she's Director for Campus Internationalization with Global Programs and Strategy Alliance. Myself, and then most importantly, Diana Yefanova, who was hired as a postdoc and actually conducted the research, did the surveys, did the focus groups and interviews. We were very fortunate to have a fabulous team of undergrad and grad students as well who helped analyze the data, look at our themes. Linnea Baird, Mary Lynn Montgomery, Sumitra Muhari Ramachandran, who's actually at the conference today. Sumitra, are you here with us? Don't take that as a bad sign. We also had many partnerships, and I want you to absorb this slide because I think it really was a critical part of how the research became successful in that it got done and that we are here to tell about it. So we had an advisory group, and I think the fact that we had an advisory group, my guess, came from Chris and Gail's wisdom of how do we tap into the expertise of this campus and beyond. So we had 25 faculty members, and you can imagine what those discussions looked like, gathering advice about how to do research. So we had a lot of agreement and disagreement about best ways to move forward. Those partnerships were both within the United States, as well as we had several faculty from Australia who've done significant work about the integration of international and domestic students. The Office of Institutional Reporting was critical in advising on large-scale surveys that they were conducting, as well as continuing to work with us on publishing data from this project. And then, of course, funding. This project wouldn't have been possible without the ability to have Diana Yefanova work with us as a postdoc. And so that funding came from a proposal we presented to the academic enhancement fee to move the research forward, and that it had been started with pilot funds from Global Programs and Strategy Alliance, as well as contributions from International Student and Scholar Services and the College of Education and Human Development. We hope that through today's session, you're going to gain from understanding what are some of the specific outcomes, and then, of course, how those might transfer to your particular environments, whether that's a classroom environment, a work environment, teaming up with students, supervising students, helping others supervise students. So really looking at how we can take that back to each of our environments. And then, of course, some opportunity to connect with others who are interested in how do we improve campus climate. There are other sessions here today focusing on how international students are rating the campus climate lower than other students on campus. So we see this as part of that work. I do want to mention that in the description of today's session, that the language suggests that we're looking at educational benefits for international students, and actually the research is about educational benefits for domestic and international students. So please keep that in mind as you hear more about the study. Give me a sec to catch up to myself, that balance of notes and not notes. We do want you to be prepared at the end of our presentation. We're going to take some time, of course, for questions, at least 5 minutes, and then we are going to engage all of us in a conversation about that transferring, how we'll apply some of this information and ideas that it sparks, as well as things that you are already doing to be successful, to be integrating and engaging students to get those educational benefits. What's great about our projects is they are already available publicly. So you will have access, I now have show and tell, to these beautiful phase 1 and phase 2 studies. So you can see in the next few minutes, you're not going to get all this information, you're going to get a taste of it. So to get into the depth of the methods, the results, we really encourage you to look online. Certainly if you are going to be citing anything from today's presentation, we really encourage you to go to the full reports so you can get deep into the data, so to speak. All right, so all that introduction, and what did we do? So we had 2 years of data collection process. Phase 1 was looking at, do we have integration, do we have interactions? And so looking at what are students saying directly are the impacts of those interactions, and then some recommendations that they had towards strategies, what helps them to gain those benefits. And then also interviews with faculty members to look at what do they feel are effective strategies towards gaining those outcomes. So phase 1 is really gathering information from individual perspectives, thinking reflectively about their experiences, while phase 2 is a direct case study method looking at 3 separate classrooms on what actually is happening there, and what is happening for the instructors to be prepared for those environments and their course syllabi presentation and how they're processing what they are doing in those teaching moments. I'm actually kind of surprised at our scope. It was, what I would say, fairly significant. We had 3 campuses, 195 students, 78 of those international students, 117 domestic, 53 faculty members, 9 international and 44 domestic. So now I have a little quiz for you. In our study, we refer to DS and IS. Any guesses what DS might stand for? Oh, you guys are good. Yes, domestic student, and thus IS, international student. And CNI. I know, this one stumped me too. When I first read it, I was like, what is that? So CNI stands for cross-national interaction, and we encourage you to be walking away from today's session thinking about the promotion of cross-national interaction, because it means certainly international to domestic student, but also within the international community. We are focusing specifically on international students in that it is the role of international student and scholar services, but also we are receiving support from the academic enhancement fee, which is a fee assessed to international undergraduate students. And so we could talk more broadly about how this work connects with looking at how we are integrating all students on our campus as well. So with phase 1, we had 2 specific research questions. First, in what ways do interactions between international students and domestic students at the University of Minnesota take place? We need to know that the phenomena occurs, right, before we can actually look at the impact. And second, how do cross-national interactions influence domestic and international student learning and development at the University of Minnesota? And so today we've selected just a few of the results that we thought might be most salient for this audience. Our data collection process, I've already alluded to it a bit, that we did focus groups, interviews, and surveys. And the surveys gave us a lot of powerful data. And by powerful, I mean, for example, with the International Student Barometer, we had a response rate of 46%. That's over 2,500 students responding, and we asked a lot of open-ended questions, so we are rich with data. The student engagement at research universities, CIRU, allowed us to tap into domestic students, so looking at directly giving them an opportunity to provide information about their interactions and outcomes. Some of you may have seen this next slide before. This is just a sample of information that we use to verify, yes, interactions are occurring so that we are satisfying that first research requirement. When you look at this slide, what you're seeing is students' response to how often they are interacting first in the classroom at the top bar, and the second bar is outside of the classroom. And of course, there's a couple of ways to look at this data. When you look at it, I would ask you to reflect on what story do you see? For example, one story is that if we look at the classroom, it's pretty great that 40% of the students are saying that they interact often. That's a pretty big number, right? But yet, you could look at it another way and say, even when students are right next to each other, the overwhelming majority of students report that they don't interact often. Right? So we know we have interaction, but chances are many of us in this room would advocate this would suggest we need more. So just one slice of a data point from International Student Barometer. Oh, did I not show you that slide? Did I move? Bumped. Oh, it's so hard to get all these things right, isn't it? All right, so now you've had advance notice of the CIRU findings. You've got these memorized now. This is really fun stuff. And by fun, I mean exciting. Chances are these are things everybody in the room might have imagined or hoped for. But now we have documentation that based on students reporting that they are interacting with international students, and then their self-report of each of these outcomes, we know that there's a correlation that as they increase their interaction, they're increasing the degree to which they believe they are able to do these things. Right? These are very powerful items, so that as an outcome, in and of itself, I feel like this is pretty satisfactory to look at what is the educational benefit of international students being on campus. So aside from the University of Minnesota awarding degrees and helping international students learn and do what they came here for, there are also these additional opportunities for domestic students to be working more effectively with others from different national backgrounds, that there's an increased interest in study abroad, that there's a increase in the self-perceived intercultural competency development. And I put 2014 because that was the year that we delved into that particular survey item. I can explain more perhaps later. And that they have an interest in world events, news, or politics. We also conducted analysis, of course, of the focus groups. And so the themes here come out and can be grouped according to attitude, skills, and knowledge. So first, when you look at this slide, my guess is this might be what we would expect, that in general, students are developing effective intercultural communication skills as well as networking. But this slide, to me, is rich in that it tells us much more than we probably initially expected. So as a result of cross-national interactions, students report leadership skills in navigating across difference, working across language differences, being an advocate for self and others, problem solving, that they're able to understand that there are different learning styles present, that they're able to take initiatives in projects, and that they gain global knowledge. Here's an example from a domestic student majoring in psychology regarding this outcome. We had German and South Korean students in the group, and hearing and understanding from their perspective how the same kind of psychology topics were discussed in their countries really helped me, and how research over there is handled. I wouldn't have otherwise learned this from class. So while in a way it's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward, we don't have this type of documentation about what are the particular outcomes, that students are learning content about their topics, their fields of study directly from international students. Faculty also report similar benefits with one exception, and that is this notion of learning to avoid tokenizing others. And I'll close before passing off to Chris about phase 2 research results. Not closing our session, just my portion. Don't get too excited about the end. So from a faculty perspective, this meant that students don't expect students to be the representative of a culture or country, and faculty don't either. A management faculty participant shared an example of giving an international student the opportunity to share her expertise with classmates. The student actually outlined things that a regular person would not know. I noticed a level of interest from the local students that was much higher than when I teach in class. She did a good job of talking about things that I had no idea about, some of the things that really only an insider would know. It was really beneficial and very interesting as well. This is from management faculty. In closing, there's a significant finding with the faculty that we really need to highlight, that faculty participants overwhelmingly reported that almost no cross-national interaction took place in their classroom unless the instructor made an effort to structure class activities and influence the culture of the classroom to enhance interaction. So we don't get any of this if we don't encourage the interactions. So that look at strategies, how do we really develop and foster this in the classroom, is the focus of phase 2. And so I'll invite Christopher Johnstone to share those results with you.
Thank you and good morning. Phase 2 was indeed the outgrowth of Barbara's setup. What we found at the end of phase 1 was that interactions in general can be challenging to students unless there's some form of structure around them. And so we took that finding and we wanted to push a little bit into phase 2. And we wanted to do some examination of what exactly it is that faculty are doing to make these interactions happen. So we had 2 research questions. The first one was, in what ways did instructors facilitate cross-national interactions in their classroom. And our second question was, what were the perceived outcomes? So what came out of this? We loosely based our study on Biggs's theory on the 3 levels of teaching. And we even sampled based on this theory a little bit. And the first stage in Biggs's work is that the students will assimilate into the existing classroom culture. So this is in some ways the default in higher education teaching. And I think maybe something that's been criticized historically, students come to my class, I teach the way I teach, they can figure it out, right? That has been maybe historically the expectation. Biggs then talked about that some instructors move on to a level 2, which is that there is an assumption of cultural difference. And because of that, we can modify our instruction to be more responsive to the cultural differences within our classroom. And then stage 3, which is actually, I'm not sure how many people actually get here in their instruction. It's an aspirational goal. But there's an assumption that there are complex differences in students, that students actually all have intersectional identities that are at work in the classroom, and that we need to work to understand what those differences are, what those identities are, and to leverage those to get our best instruction. Now, culture is part of that, but not everything. So we went about our work in a case study. We decided that we wanted to look in depth into some instructors' work to find out how this was working. We wanted to get inside the classroom. We got a lot of results based on interviews from phase 1 and from surveys, but we wanted to see how things were really at work, and so we jumped into a case study. We decided we were going to do our case study in a large university system in the upper Midwest in the United States, right? And we contacted 3 instructors, and those 3 instructors, if you look at your left, your right, sorry, the very right column, they were all part of the Internationalizing Teaching and Learning group, who is a group of faculty that meets every year that learns a little bit about how do I internationalize my curriculum. And all of them at some point had expressed some commitment into facilitating cross-national interaction in their class. So that was one of our most important pieces. And then we wanted to sample across academic areas, a little bit about across years of experience, and then look at some other variables which, for example, language other than English wasn't that important in the process, but we also want to know, did study abroad experience help or not, as an indicator of a level of, I would say, personal internationalization. We wanted to look at across different size classes. These were all undergraduate courses, so we had a range from a smaller class, 14 students, to a larger class, 40. And within that, we really had 4 different research methods. We had focus groups with the students. We did some individual interviews, some classroom observations, some syllabi review. So we looked at where is the intentionality in the syllabi. And it's not on this table here, but we also looked at what some of the assignments were from the instructors. Again, this was our opportunity and our process for digging in, for understanding how this was all working in classrooms. And we had some interesting results. Our first result was that there was a really transparent rationale for cross-national interaction in classrooms. So each of these instructors said, this is important to me, I'm going to structure my class to make this work. And the reason why was often what I would call an intercultural or maybe a 21st century job skill. So our instructors were saying things like, I need students to learn how to get along because future in their careers, they're going to need to work across cultures very effectively. In their future jobs, they're going to need these skills. They're going to need strong communication skills, etc. One of our instructors said, somewhere I say at the beginning of the class that I'll force you, international domestic students, to sit together, and you're going to learn from each other. I also tell them the other rationale is that all of you are going to get jobs, and if you want a job, you can't be quiet. So in many ways, the instructor has said, I'm going to facilitate activities in my classroom that I believe are going to benefit you 5, 10, 20 years down the road in your future careers. Right? This was the rationale for the cross-national interaction. And each of our instructors designed this in a different way. And if you think about how they did it, it was really three characteristics that they were looking at. Number one was the content of the class and what was appropriate for the content of the class. Two, they thought carefully about their teaching style and what was comfortable to them. And then three, within that and within certain assignments, how could they make cross-national interaction work in the classroom? And each of our instructors had a different way of doing it. So we didn't come out of this by looking at three different classrooms and saying, oh my gosh, there's one theme that works across all. What we found is that each of our instructors did it differently. And that might have replicated itself if we had 50 instructors. But we did find some commonalities. So we found that groups and pairs were often used. Every instructor used pairs. And there may have been some reason for that. It wasn't verbalized, but every single instructor used pairs in class. And then the tasks were really different depending on, again, the content of the class. So in biology, there were a lot of quizzes. So the students helped each other prep for the quizzes. And they did some biological simulations. In the economics class, there was classwork that was due at the end of different classes. And then papers where students could help peer edit each other. And then finally, in public speaking, there were group presentations where smaller groups would present to each other for practice before the larger group, and then also discussions about the content. So as you can see, 3 classes, 3 different ways of doing it, all with intentional cross-national interaction. The groupings were intentionally designed by the instructors to ensure that students were interacting with each other. And in addition to that, the tasks were clear and concrete. Going back to what Barbara said, we found that it's not, or our instructor said it wasn't particularly effective to just put students into group and say, go to it. We found it was more effective when the groups were thoughtfully constructed and when the tasks were thoughtfully instructed. So then students were comfortable and knew how to get started. So what did we learn out of this? Well, one thing we learned was that even though the instructors had visions of great job skills for the students 20 years down the road and intercultural skills, that at the end of the classes, they weren't really sure if this happened or not. There wasn't really a way of measuring that, and this wasn't really part necessarily of the classroom content. And so our instructor said, one of them said, no, I've never specifically taught to the student, to this student learning outcome, and this is the intercultural student outcomes that we're talking about. I know that they're getting something out of it, which is cross-national interaction. I did notice that the students interacted really well. They actually were working as a cooperative group. And so what this instructor was saying is, I think, and I hope that down the line we're going to have great outcomes in terms of the students' capacity to work across culture, but I don't really know right now. That's not part of my course. A second instructor said something very similar. If I really wanted to get cross-cultural communication, I don't feel like I've attained that at all. I do think getting students to speak with one another, that's not sort of in their self-determined groups. I do think there's a benefit, but I don't think that the content of the course was necessarily tied directly with that effort. I didn't look at that. So I think what the instructors were saying was, I do have lofty futuristic goals, but somewhere I'm still grounded in this course. And I'm hoping that some of these intercultural outcomes come out of my work. This actually aligned somewhat with what the students were saying. So we talked to students separately. And what we found was that their goals and that their perceptions of cross-national interactions were very concrete and very, I would say, short future-oriented. Getting through next week, getting through the course, getting through the content so I understand. Look at a couple of things that the students said. I think for overall effect, it's very important to have diversity in econ classes, especially because when you work with other students from other countries in your projects, in your papers, they can contribute more important ideas, which can really help you to learn more thoroughly about your subject. So when we talk to the students about it, the whole idea of becoming global citizens, thinking about great job skills later in life, becoming fantastic interculturalists was not as important as, can I figure out my content a little bit better? And by the way, this diversity helps me to do so, right? A very, I would say, short future orientation. And that's neither good nor bad. It is just where I think where the students are developmentally. And I think if you think about the pressure of getting through a university program, the immediate goals are quite important, right? Here's what a second student said. I learned evolution by memorizing. This was at home. But I came here and I learned evolution, and they consider other processes. And one of my classmates from Sri Lanka And he learned about evolution in different ways. So we can kind of share these ideas together. Again, this is, we are leveraging the diversity, the cross-national interaction in our groups to help us figure out this difficult content together. So we had a couple of interesting takeaways from this. I think number one was that intentionality pays dividends. No matter what the outcomes were, the instructors were saying that the groups seemed to be working. And the reason why they were working was that I was intentional about how to make the groups work, right? We don't have any 20-year outcomes to report at this time, but both the students and the instructors said, this process works because we had the structure we needed. Secondly, the student goals are likely to differ from faculty goals and are more content-focused. Difference, however you define that, matters because it helps us to better understand the content. And if we go back to Biggs for a minute, this is something we might dive further into in future studies, that if we're looking at intersectionality in students, how students have multiple identities, both their international status as well as other identities, how do we figure those identities into the process of learning content better, which in this study, at least with these undergraduates, appeared to matter most. We're going to stop there. We've had study one, phase one, and phase two. Stop for a moment. We're going to take your questions, and then we've got a short discussion afterward. Does anybody have a question?
I can see your study and the intentions to make the faculty or the domestic kind of DS on campus more aware of this cross-national interaction. That's very very good intention. But from the other side, from the international students' perspective, I'm wondering, is there any kind of extra support for those international students? Because I interact with many undergraduates from China, because I'm working the Chinese program. I have to hire tutors to tutor our American students Chinese language. So when I talk to them, the very first thing they are struggling with is the English language. Sometimes I even let them make a reading comprehension questions for my American students in English, because we have a Chinese English translation, but the questions are all in English, just to make sure the American students get the gist of the text. And when I saw their writings, it's not horrible, but lots of errors and mistakes and misexpression and so on. So I'm wondering any extra support that can help those individuals.
Thank you very much for the question. I'm not sure the extent to which this is being recorded for the purposes of replaying, so I'll summarize your question, looking at what type of support is available for international students whose English is second language or third or fourth. And there are significant resources on campus. And I think we've done a really good job, we, meaning campus, collectively, for students. And there are staff, they may even be presenting right now. Mel, Yay, do you want to give a shout out to the support that you provide?
Sure. The Minnesota English Language Program offers ESL courses for students that they can take as electives or if they're required to. And then also student English language support is one-on-one tutoring for international undergraduate students that any of them can sign up for. And consultants in that program are MA students in the Teaching ESL program, so they're trained in how to work with those students.
And so with the academic enhancement fee, there have been an increase in resources as well. And for example, at ISSS, we have staff who are doing additional academic counseling and support. And they are compiling resources, and we have a great list on our website. Can you help me figure out what's the pathway to that? Is it just under academic resources? So the intention is to be informing faculty and staff about additional support that's available, so that there's a place to go to get direction back out to what are all the campus resources. Great.
And that
Yeah.
just for a moment, and then we'll come to this one. So,
Yeah.
a second piece of that, I think, and something we need to keep doing as a university, is to challenge our assumptions a little bit. So, yes, students are coming who have English as a second, third, or fourth language, and there's no doubt that English support is important. The second piece of it is, and something we didn't address in this study, we found out what are the best ways to go about creating cross-national interaction, right? What we didn't think about was that maybe this isn't the best way to teach for all students, right? And that gets, I think, to that Biggs level 3. There is a little bit of an assumption, I think, in U.S. higher education in general that interaction is the best way to go. That is not the best way for all students. And so I think we need to be reflective as a faculty community to say, okay, that we know the ways to promote the best interactions, but is interaction every time, every place, always the best for all students? And maybe there are other ways that students learn best, but we won't know that till we know them. Right?
That's great. And just for fun, students did not report language barrier as a challenge, although faculty did. Same students, right? Because it's a case study approach. So we're not exactly sure what that means, but I think it's an interesting finding to note. Great. It's very hard to see with the light, so we have no idea whose hand has been up first. So if you feel like your hand has been up for a while, great.
Quick question about syllabus review. Is there any common understanding among faculties across the universities that they should include international aspect or not? Because you also included syllabus as one of the criteria to major internationalization. So could you share any latest information about institutional policies on syllabus regarding on internationalization?
We would be in support. Chris, do you want to?
There are 7 student development outcomes that have been developed by this university, and faculty must include one of them, obviously, in each of their courses. So sometimes there is this international cross-cultural piece. Sometimes there are other elements that are needed. But as a university as a whole, we need to be sure that we are addressing these student learning and student development outcomes.
Thank you.
Question is about your sample may not be that large, but if you follow those students further on, I mean, will we have higher retention rates, or I mean, how do we know some of those other benefits?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of the really significant questions at the start of the research was, what are going to be the best ways to approach this? Should we do only surveys? Should we do interview? And so it really was that phase 1 was designed, to just get a sense, kind of what's going on from fairly large numbers when you look at especially including the CIRO and the International Student Barometer. And then the advisement was, let's dig into the classroom because it'll really shape, what's next. So there are really probably a solid 23 to 27 different directions that could now be taken. And so I think that it's helpful to just hear and imagine what might be the possibilities. To look at these particular students at what their outcomes wouldn't be very difficult at all or time consuming. So it's great to think of those.
I had a question about the sample size again with the students. So we said we're at MELP, and for our students there, most of them are just taking the intensive English program classes, and so they're not degree-seeking students. So I was just wondering if your sample of international students was limited to just degree-seeking students, and if so, if you think there'd be a benefit to maybe looking at non-degree-seeking students who are international students here at the university, but aren't included.
Yes, so this work was done with degree-seeking students. We could double-check and pull out and see if there are any particular questions. There was a subset done at least 2 years with International Student Barometer with MELP. So we do have separate data there. And I think all of it, just it's fun to be really thinking and hoping that there's some energy around continuing this type of work, that all of us could be participating in using the data to really dig into what the story is and then telling that story. All right. Yes, maybe one more and then we'll switch to focusing on strategy. Yes.
Kind of alluded to this when you said that maybe cross-cultural interaction isn't the best way for all students, and I kind of wondered that when the two comments from students were both from domestic students who found benefit in getting that international perspective, but do the international students feel the same way? Do they also feel like they're getting something out of those interactions in the classroom? And I wondered if the data broke that apart at all.
Yes. So yeah, there was reports of again that appreciation for understanding content better. There's a nuance here which is very interesting in that as a study we looked at cross-national interaction, and a little bit that was through almost a biased lens, because for students who have international status, almost every interaction is going to be cross-national, just because of the numbers at this university. And so I think for those students it was the ideas were a little less novel than for our domestic students who really had to think about it, if that makes sense. But the pieces about the content were very similar. Sharing ideas does help me to learn. I don't think, to come back to your original point, I don't think that learning cross-culturally was what I challenged. It was more, is it learning in groups in general? Is that the best way for all students to learn? I think there's value to it, certainly. But sometimes I think we do need to question this time, every time in our classes, which sometimes is what happens. The same way as the other side, right?
And then in the Phase 1 report, you would be able to identify some of the similarities and difference with international and domestic student outcomes. So taking our next steps, this has been hopefully an opportunity for you to gather some concrete outcomes that can occur, and then of course these great questions about what's next. How might we think about this differently? So for each of us in the room, looking at what can you take from this? And so we would encourage you to either reflect on your own or turn to those around you, whichever you prefer, and consider, what can you do with this information? How can it impact your own work? So if you're going to talk to each other, go ahead. so engaged in the conversation. I hate to interrupt. They're so engaged in the conversation. Thank you very much for your participation in this reflective piece about how to transfer what outcomes and topics we've been talking about here today. We have opportunity for one or two groups or individuals to share your ideas about how can you apply these outcomes to your own work. Anybody like to share how you might be applying it to your own work? That was not intended to stop all conversation. Great. Yes, thank you.
Make one quick comment, which
Sure.
I really appreciated that you started the presentation with, I think this was this presentation, but thinking about our international students as assets, not deficits, right? And I think that, I mean, you know that, and you know you should be doing that, so I just really appreciate that main message I'm taking home today is really taking that message to heart. So thank you for that.
That is fabulous. Thank you, and thank you for your willingness to share that with the group. Great. Yes.
I think just the notion of being intentional about what you're doing. And many of these things, we're trying to do it for us. And, you know, we trying to create structures for that C&I. But at the same time, you know, we're not as intentional about it as we probably should be. And I think just inserting that, and even within the classroom, just the instructors, the faculty being intentional about how to accomplish this. I think there are some really wonderful faculty that we have in course that are doing it without being intentional about it. And you know, how much work would we do had they planned a little bit more?
Great. And maybe for all of us, it just re-energizes us. We have a lot of demands about our work and the types of things we could be improving. So getting some energy to incorporate. I'd like to close with sharing just one brief example of, while I think this work is very complex, sometimes, not always, but sometimes simple things can have impact. I had opportunity to teach a course last spring, and it was a small group, and part of the content was directly related to intercultural communication. So there's opportunity within that content, of course, to have some natural intersections with the types of things we're talking about here today. But one of the things that I decided to do was not only learn the students' names, but ask each student to learn each other's names. And so we did just a few check-ins. And so maybe even, after we had practiced and learned each other's names, week 4, I would put up, all the names on the PowerPoint. And I would say, okay, there are 3 people who aren't here yet. Name them. Or I would say, take out a piece of paper and close your eyes and imagine who's all here, and then write down the names that you remember, and then go back and fill in the names that you don't. So just kind of reminding us all, like it takes some work to do that. The impact, I wasn't planning to make any assessment of it, but it came out for several of the students, how this helped them feel that they were part of a community. And one student in particular commented that when she was at home studying, she knew that she was somebody, right? She mattered. People knew who she was. When she came to the United States, because people didn't really know where her country was, she was starting to feel like she was disappearing, like she really wasn't here. And that people knowing her name made her feel like she had a place. It's like, wow, that was not my intention. I wanted people to be able to say their names, to be inviting them into conversations. But I didn't realize the depth of some of the impact over something really, really not very time-consuming. So again, towards that intentionality, towards the work that we're all doing. And thank you so much on behalf of Chris, myself, Gail, and all of the members of the team. We really appreciate your interest in the topic. And now it's lunch.